Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into a period of history that shaped the world we live in today. A time of spies, nuclear tension, and a battle of ideologies that never exploded into a full-scale war, yet its impact was felt across the entire globe. This is the story of how the Cold War began. In 1945, the world let out a collective sigh of relief. The most brutal and devastating conflict in human history, World War II, was finally over. The Axis powers were defeated, and people looked forward to an era of peace and rebuilding. But behind the celebrations and parades, a new, quieter conflict was brewing. This wasn't a war fought with massive armies clashing on battlefields, but a war of nerves, of influence, and of fear. It was the dawn of the Cold War. To understand how this happened, we need to look at the state of the world right after World War II. Europe, once the center of global power, was in absolute ruins. Cities like London, Warsaw, and Dresden were reduced to rubble. Economies had collapsed, infrastructure was shattered, and millions of people were dead, wounded, or displaced. The old empires of Britain and France were exhausted, their power and influence dramatically weakened. Out of this global devastation, two nations rose to become the new superpowers, standing head and shoulders above everyone else, the United States and the Soviet Union. On one side, you had the United States. Its mainland was untouched by the war, its economy was booming thanks to wartime production, and it possessed the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb. America emerged as the world's leading economic and military power, championing the ideals of capitalism, democracy, and individual freedom. On the other side was the Soviet Union. While it had suffered unimaginable losses during the war with estimates of over 27 million dead, its military might was undeniable. The Red Army had single-handedly pushed the Nazis back from the gates of Moscow all the way to Berlin, liberating and then occupying most of Eastern Europe in the process. Led by the iron-fisted Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union was driven by a completely different ideology, communism. It believed in a state-controlled economy, a single-party political system, and the global spread of socialist revolution. These two giants, once allies against a common enemy, now found themselves face-to-face, each with a fundamentally different vision for the future of the world. The USA wanted to create a global system based on free markets and democratic governments. The USSR wanted to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states to protect itself from future invasions and to expand its sphere of influence. This clash of interests and ideologies was the core engine of the Cold War. The world wasn't big enough for both of their visions to coexist peacefully. The first real signs of this impending conflict appeared even before the war was officially over. In February 1945, the leaders of the Big Three Allied powers, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met at the Yalta Conference in the Crimea. On the surface, the meeting was about planning the final defeat of Nazi Germany and deciding what to do with Europe after the war. They agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation and to create the United Nations to prevent future wars. But beneath the handshakes and diplomatic smiles, deep-seated mistrust was already growing. Roosevelt and Churchill hoped to secure promises from Stalin for free and fair elections in the countries of Eastern Europe that the Red Army was liberating, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. They wanted these nations to be able to choose their own destinies. Stalin, however, had a very different agenda. He saw Eastern Europe as a crucial security buffer for the Soviet Union. Having been invaded from the West twice in just over 30 years, he was determined to install friendly, pro-Soviet, communist governments in these countries, whether the people wanted them or not. He made vague promises at Yalta, but his actions spoke louder than his words. He had no intention of letting go of his grip on the region. Churchill famously wrote that he had a very bad feeling about the future, sensing that a new, dark shadow was falling across the continent. This meeting, meant to build a lasting peace, instead laid the groundwork for the division of Europe. As the months went by, the promises made at Yalta quickly unraveled. The Soviet Union began systematically installing communist regimes across Eastern Europe. Non-communist leaders were arrested, elections were rigged, and political opposition was crushed. One by one, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and others fell under Soviet control. This led Winston Churchill to deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946. He declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. This powerful metaphor perfectly captured the new reality. Europe was now divided into two hostile camps. To the west lay the free, democratic nations backed by the United States. To the east lay the communist satellite states, controlled by Moscow. The dividing line was no longer just a political concept. It was becoming a physical and ideological wall. The United States watched this Soviet expansion with growing alarm. President Harry Truman, who took office after Roosevelt's death, adopted a much tougher stance against the Soviets. He and his advisors developed a new foreign policy to deal with this threat: containment. The idea was simple, but profound. The US would not try to roll back communism where it already existed, but it would do everything in its power to prevent it from spreading any further. This policy was put into action through two major initiatives. First, the Truman Doctrine of 1947, which pledged US support both financial and military to any nation threatened by communism. The first recipients were Greece and Turkey, which were facing internal communist insurgencies. Second, and even more ambitious, was the Marshall Plan. The US offered billions of dollars in economic aid to help rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. The logic was that prosperous, stable nations would be less susceptible to the appeal of communism. The plan was a massive success, fueling a remarkable economic recovery in countries like France, West Germany, and Italy, and solidifying their alliance with the United States. The Soviet Union forbade its Eastern European satellites from accepting the aid, deepening the economic divide between East and West. Nowhere was this division more visible or more dangerous than in the heart of defeated Germany. As agreed, the country and its capital, Berlin, were each divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The problem was that Berlin itself was located deep inside the Soviet zone of East Germany. This made the Western-controlled sectors of the city West Berlin an isolated island of capitalism and democracy in a sea of communism. Stalin saw West Berlin as a bone in his throat, a constant and embarrassing advertisement for Western prosperity right on his doorstep. He was determined to force the Western powers out. In June 1948, he made his move. The Soviets cut off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, initiating the Berlin blockade. They hoped to starve the city's 2 million inhabitants into submission, forcing the Western allies to abandon it. The world held its breath. This was the first major confrontation of the Cold War. Would the US try to force its way through the blockade with tanks, risking World War III? Or would they give up Berlin, a huge propaganda victory for the Soviets? President Truman chose a third, incredibly bold option: the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew round-the-clock missions, landing in West Berlin every few minutes to deliver everything the city needed to survive: food, coal, medicine, and other essential supplies. It was a monumental logistical feat and an incredible display of Western resolve. The candy bombers, pilots who dropped sweets for the children of Berlin, became symbols of hope and defiance. By May 1949, it was clear the blockade had failed. Stalin was forced to lift it. The Berlin blockade was a critical turning point. It solidified the division of Germany into 2 separate countries: the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, allied with the West, and the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, a Soviet satellite. It also convinced the Western powers that they needed a formal military alliance to counter the Soviet threat. In 1949, they formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a pact in which member nations pledged that an attack on one was an attack on all. The Cold War lines were now firmly drawn. The world had been split in two. What started as a breakdown of an alliance had escalated into a global standoff between 2 nuclear-armed superpowers. The tension that began in the ruins of post-war Europe would now spread across the globe, leading to proxy wars, an arms race, and decades of fear and uncertainty. But the story was far from over. This was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. The events we've discussed today set the stage for decades of conflict. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because in our next video, we'll explore how the Cold War went global, from the Korean War to the Cuban Missile Crisis. You won't want to miss it. See you next time.